Hello, my name is the European Canadian, and today we're going to be talking about the Autoblinda AB40. The AB40 armoured car was the most innovative reconnaissance vehicle of the Regio Esercito, or the Royal Italian Army, developed before the Second World War. FIAT and Ansaldo collaborated to respond to two requests for new armoured cars. The first was to replace the old Lancia 1ZM, FIAT-Terni-Tripoli and FIAT 611 armoured cars in service in the Royal Italian Army, whilst the second was to replace the Lancia 1ZM in service in the Polizia dell'Africa Italiana, or the Italian police in Africa. The High Command of the Royal Italian Army considered armoured cars fundamental to its modern warfare doctrine, firstly in the long-range reconnaissance role and secondly for infantry support tasks. The Italian Army was one of the first arms to test armoured cars, with the Fiat Arsenal in 1912. Later, during World War I, the Italians were positively impressed by the capabilities of the Lancia and Fiat armoured cars. In the mid-30s, the Royal Italian Army realized that the Lancia 1ZM and FIAT-Terni-Tripoli armoured cars produced during the First World War, while still moderately effective in the infantry support role, were by now poorly armed, poorly protected, and with substandard off-road driving characteristics. In 1932, the Fiat 611 was produced. This armoured truck was based on the Fiat 611C chassis with a speed of 28 km an hour and a range of 180 km. But this low speed and short range did not impress the High Command, and less than 50 were produced. In 1937, 10 Lancia 1ZMs were sent to assist the Nationalists in the Spanish Civil War, where it was clear that although still efficient as support vehicles, they could no longer carry out reconnaissance activities. In late 1937, the Royal Army decided to issue an order for the development of a new armoured car for long-range reconnaissance. In the 1930s, the PAI, the police corps in charge of the security of the Italian colonies, still used the old Lancia 1ZM, which were not very suitable for desert use, and also improvised armoured cargo trucks to face the anti-colonialist groups in Libya and Ethiopia. In 1935 to 1936, the PAI tested some light tanks, but they were not appreciated for their short range, which was considered unsuitable for the required tasks. In 1937, out of their own accord, the command of the PAI requested Italian companies the development of an armoured car prototype for long-range reconnaissance. Fiat and Ansaldo collaborated on the project, deciding to combine the two requests and to produce a single vehicle that would meet the needs of the PAI and of the Royal Italian Army. Thus, the AB40 was born. A first wooden model of the armoured car was presented to Army officers during their visit to the Ansaldo factory in Genoa on the 11th of April 1938. The mock-up was very similar to the final vehicle, with four-wheel drive, four steered wheels with independent suspension, petrol engine, armament composed of three 8mm machine guns, and 4 crew members. After the production of the wooden mock-up, two prototypes of the armoured car, then called Autoblindo Mitragliatrice, or ABM, which means machine gun armoured car, were built. There is no precise date for the construction of the first prototype, but available photos are dated the 5th of May 1939, and the prototype was registered as Autoblinda RE for the Regio Esercito. The configuration of the front armour on this first prototype and on the prototype of the armoured car destined for the PAI initially registered the Polizia Coloniale 0021 would be the one maintained on the final model. However, the headlights were not yet in the fairings inside the superstructure, and the maintenance hatches on the engine hood were without air intakes. The official presentation of the two armoured car prototypes for the colonial police and the army took place on the 15th of May 1939, on the occasion of the inauguration of the Fiat Mirafiori plant in Turin. Then, these were shown for the first time to Benito Mussolini, the Army High Command, and the PAI commanders. Mussolini was very impressed by the new vehicle and appreciated its silhouette. Some Italian newspapers of the time wrote that the Duce of Italy defined the vehicle as an example of Italian elegance. The two vehicles differed in some details. The colonial police version was equipped with a large headlamp fixed on the roof of the turret and had a vertical radio antenna fixed on the front right of the superstructure, a siren on the rear part of the hull, and an armoured plate covering the spare wheels. The version intended for the Army, provisionally re-registered as Test T0.64, was distinguishable by the inclination of the armour at the front of the superstructure and the fact that the spare wheels were unprotected. Compared to the prototype identified in the photos of the 5th of May 1939, during the tests in May and June of 1939, the Royal Army prototype had the air intakes on the engine deck. On both vehicles, all headlights were fitted with armour. It is not clear if the prototype of the 5th of May 1939 and the one with the Test TO.64 plate are the same vehicle, but the Fiat archives in Turin do not mention the production of other prototypes. The first prototype of the version intended for the Army, registered Test TO.64, was sent to the Centro Studi della Motorizzazione, or the Center for Motorization Studies in Rome in June 1939 to undergo evaluation tests. The vehicle then participated in the maneuvers of August 1939 in Piedmont. It then received the rear registration plate RE3 on a triangular plate. At the end of the tests, the engineers at the Center for Motorization Studies suggested some modifications and improvements, in particular to simplify the shape of the mudguards and incorporate the front headlights into the front plate of the superstructure to prevent them from restricting visibility on bends. The sides of the front of the superstructure were modified, taking the example of the first version of the prototype to facilitate construction. Tests on the prototype intended for the PAI, re-registered the Polizia Coloniale 0501, were conducted in the operating theatre. The vehicle, sent to Africa Orientale Italiana, or AOI, which means the Italian East Africa, modern-day Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Somalia, disembarked in Massawa in Eritrea on the 3rd of June 1939. From there, it left for a 13,000-kilometer test run before returning to Massawa on the 12th of September. Despite the difficult weather conditions, the armoured car was deemed a success. It was then sent back to Italy, accompanied by a favourable report containing some proposed modifications: addition of an anti-aircraft machine gun mount on the turret, replacement of the enormous fixed headlight on the turret with a smaller one which could be manoeuvred by the commander, and installation of a system that allowed the radio antenna to fold up on the right side of the superstructure, and removal of the spare wheel protection. After receiving these improvements, the prototype, called AB6, was sent to the PAI training center in Tivoli near Rome. In the summer of 1940, it was re-registered as Polizia Africa Italiana 0501 and then sent to Libya. The test showed that the vehicle had excellent off-road driving characteristics and armor more than adequate for the role for which it was intended. Some modifications for speeding up production and eliminating some defects were made. However, tests showed that the armament, composed of 3 medium machine guns, was not suitable for infantry support, but the imminent entry into the war and the need for new vehicles forced production to start anyway, while FIAT and Ansaldo technicians developed a new version. The thickness of the armor proved to be more than adequate to defend the crew from infantry fire, and the hull proved to be very versatile and adapted to the requirements. The designers tried to modify the turret to mount a more powerful main armament, and on the 18th of March 1940, the designation was changed and the vehicle received the name Autoblindo Mod 1940, or AB40, the Armored Car Mod 1940. A last prototype of the AB40 was produced, with the RE116B registration plate. It can be distinguished from the earlier vehicles by the absence of a headlight on the turret, the elimination of the two rear air intakes on the turret, and the adoption of new wheel rims and the addition of a no-tech headlight on the front of the superstructure. On the standard model of the AB40, the anti-aircraft gun mount and the no-tech headlight were not mounted. The front fenders were shortened, while a second horn was added on the right front fender. Mass production began in January of 1941, and the first 5 AB40 pre-series, registered 117B to 121B, were completed in March of the same year. By July 1941, 17 armored cars had been delivered and another 80 chassis were waiting to be equipped with turrets. The most important specifications for the Italian designers were the off-road driving characteristics. The vehicle was built starting from the chassis of the TM40 artillery tractor, or the medium tractor mod 1940, a vehicle with 4 enormous wheels used to tow medium artillery pieces in development since 1938 and which only entered service in 1942. One of the major issues with previous armored cars was the time needed to disengage from a firefight. In order to withdraw, these old armored cars had to make complex and slow maneuvers that were not feasible in the narrow streets of African villages. The problem was solved by adding another driving position on the right side of the back of the crew compartment of the new armored car. The steering system was then modified, allowing both the front and rear drivers to steer with all 4 wheels. The vehicle was powered by a Fiat SPA ABM1 6-cylinder water-cooled inline petrol engine, giving out 78 horsepower. It was positioned in the rear of the hull with a Zenith Type 42 TTVP carburetor housed in the back of the engine compartment. The engine was designed by Fiat and produced by its subsidiary, the SPA in Turin. The AB40 had a speed on roads of 80 km an hour, while the range was about 400 km. There were 3 fuel tanks. The main one, holding 118 litres, was placed between the floor of the crew compartment and the bottom armoured plate. The secondary 57-litre tank was placed in front of the driver, while the reserve one, with 20 litres, was mounted under the machine gun at the back. The total was 195 litres. The vehicle had 4-wheel drive and all steering with independent shock absorbers on each wheel, which gave excellent off-road mobility to the armoured cars. Also, the spare wheels placed on the sides of the hull were left free to rotate to help the vehicle overcome obstacles. The armour on the entire hull and superstructure consisted of bolted plates 9mm thick. The turret also consisted of 9mm thick plates on the front, sides, and back. The wheel fenders were also armoured to prevent enemy fire from piercing the tyres. The bottom had a protection of 8mm, while the hull and turret roof received 6mm plates. In general, for the tasks the light armoured car had to perform, the armour was more than adequate, protecting the crew from enemy infantry weapons and shrapnel. The hull of the armoured car had an internal structure on which the plates were bolted. At the rear of the superstructure were the 2 armoured access doors, divided in 2 parts that could be opened separately. The upper part had a slit to use the crew's personal weapons for close defence. On the right, the horn was placed at the front, the pickaxe was placed on the right side, and the exhaust pipe was placed on the rear mudguard. The 2 spare wheels were placed in 2 fairings on the sides of the superstructure. In the ferroviaria, or the railway version, the support in the fairing was modified to allow two wheels to be attached on each side instead of one. Above the engine compartment, there were two air intakes and two hatches for engine maintenance. On the top were the cooling grille and the two rear headlights. Not much is known about the radio system of the AB40 pre-series, except that it was not the same system as on the standard AB, as the antenna was mounted on the right side of the vehicle. On the standard vehicles, the radio system model, the RF3M, produced by Magneti Marelli, was placed on the left wall of the superstructure in the middle. After March of 1941, this was installed on all vehicles of the AB series. It consisted of a transmitter and receiver placed one on top of the other. Underneath them, on the floor, the power supply was placed, while the batteries were placed in the double bottom of the floor near the main fuel tank. There were two pairs of headphones and microphones, one usable by the front driver and the second by the rear machine gunner. On the left was placed an antenna, which rested on a V-support welded at the back of the superstructure. The mounted antenna could be lowered to be horizontal. When hoisted up, it was 3 meters high, but could reach 7 meters fully extended, with a maximum range of 60 kilometers. In fact, in order to open the upper part of the left door, it was necessary to raise the antenna by a few degrees. On the front of the armored car, the front driver had, apart from the slit and the hyposcope for driving, the steering wheel, the dashboard, and in front of the steering wheel, the 57-liter fuel tank and brake fluid tank. On his left was the gear lever with 6 gears, the handbrake, the intercom panel, and the control lever, which, when lowered, allowed the rear driver to take control of the vehicle. On the right, at the top, there was a crank that allowed the raising or lowering of the radio antenna and a box with a spare hyposcope. The driver's backrest could be lowered to allow him to access his position. On the two sides above the wheel fairings, there were two headlights with armored doors that were raised and lowered by the driver with one lever. Behind the driver's seat, in the turret, there was the position of the vehicle commander gunner. There was no turret basket, but there was a support with pedals which fired the machine guns. On the sides of the hull were the ammunition racks that occupied most of the free space. On the floor on the right, there was a large container that held machine gun barrels and equipment. Behind the racks, there was enough space for a couple of small containers for equipment and one fire extinguisher on the left side. At the back were the rear driver on the left and the machine gunner on the right. Their seats were foldable and the steering wheel was secured with a butterfly screw and was easily removable to facilitate crew access and exit. Between the two seats were the dashboard, gear lever with 4 gears, handbrake and the direction control lever. The intercom panel was between the vision slit and the machine gun ball support. Between the two crew members and the engine compartment, there was not an armored bulkhead, but 2 tanks. On the right was a 57-liter fuel tank, and, on the right, one for the engine cooling systems with water. The problem of the lack of a bulkhead was never solved, and the risk of fire was always very high. Under the machine gunner was the vehicle's power battery, and to the right of the machine gun were headphones and the radio microphone. At the back of the vehicle was the engine compartment, which was not easy to access for maintenance because it had only 2 access doors. Behind the engine, there was the radiator and the oil tank. The turret of the AB40 was called Mod 1940. And it was developed and produced by Ansaldo and was the same used on the L640 prototype called M6T. The single-seater turret was octagonal with 1 hatch on the turret roof for the vehicle commander gunner. On the sides, the turret had 3 slots on the sides and 1 in the rear and 2 air intakes to avoid the risk of intoxication of the crew, as the vehicle did not have fans or smoke extractors. On the roof, there was a periscope of the tank commander next to the hatch, which allowed a view of the battlefield and could rotate 360 degrees. The armament was composed of three 8mm caliber Breda Mod 38 machine guns. These had curved 24-round magazines placed on top. This magazine was derived from the Breda Mod 37 medium infantry machine gun. The maximum elevation of the machine guns in the turret was plus 18 degrees, while the depression was minus 9. The third machine gun was positioned on the right side of the vehicle, oriented to the back and placed on a ball mount. The rear machine gun could be dismounted and fitted on an anti-aircraft support, the same as that used on the M-series tanks on the roof of the turret. From the photographs, however, it can be seen that only the pre-series armored cars received the anti-aircraft mount. In total, there were 2,040 rounds of 8x59mm RB Breda ammunition loaded in 85 machine gun magazines stored in wooden racks painted in white. 45 were stored on the right side of the hull and 40 on the left. Although hardly ever used, the M39AP, or the armor-piercing shells, were available for the machine gun. The bullet weighed 0.012 grams and, with a muzzle velocity of 780 meters per second, could penetrate a 16mm RHA, or rolled homogeneous armor, plate at 90 degrees at a distance of 100 meters. Standard ammunition with the same muzzle velocity penetrated 11mm at 100 meters. The armament was not ideal, especially because the magazines carried only 24 rounds, which did not allow for continued suppressing fire. The tires used on the AB40 were produced by the Pirelli factory in Milan, as were almost all the tires on Italian vehicles. Pirelli produced several tires for the 60cm or 24-inch rims used on the TM40 transport vehicles and also AB series armored cars. Three types of tires were used. In the African theater, Libya, 9.75 by 24-inch or 25 by 60cm tires were used. For use in Europe, such as Italy and the Balkans, Artiglio, or claw, 9 by 24-inch or 22.8 by 60cm tires were used. The third type was used on the Ferroviaria version. The wheels used were train wheels modified by Fiat to adapt them to the AB40 rim. The PAI prototype, of which there are several photographs, was different from the standard AB40. The wheel rims were more elaborate. In order to speed up production, these were replaced by a more resistant 6-spoke model. The slit for personal weapons on the side door was not installed. In its place, there was only a less sophisticated slot used for the same role. Another obvious detail was the radio antenna that was mounted on the left side. On the AB40 and the later AB40 and 41 hybrids, the antenna was mounted on the right side. The radio system of the prototype is unknown. The turret had 4 air intakes but no slots, and as on the prototypes, a fixed headlight was mounted on the roof of the turret. On the right side, near the door, was fixed the jack that on the standard models was transported inside the large box on the right side of the vehicle. The mudguards were longer and larger to protect the wheels from enemy fire. However, often when driving off-road, the mudguards would hit obstacles and bend. In some cases, the bent part would cut the tire. The testing of the prototype of the armored car in Africa and the study of the Soviet BA-6 heavy armored car captured intact during the Spanish Civil War, supplied to the Spanish Republican Army by the Soviets, made the Italian High Command understand that the 3 machine gun armament inherited from the Lancia 1ZM was no longer suitable for the needs of modern warfare. Production was started anyway while a solution was being considered. Ansaldo quickly proposed to install a new turret called Mod 1941, developed for the standard version of the L640 light tank, on the chassis of the AB40. Due to the weight increase from 6.8 to 7.4 tons, after some time Fiat Spa proposed to replace the engine with an enhanced version, the Fiat Spa ABM2 6-cylinder, giving out 88 horsepower. This version was not immediately tested, but when it was accepted in service, the new version had some problems. In order to produce the SPA ABM2 engine, the company had to modify the assembly lines, and this took time. For a time, the old SPA ABM1 engine was still mounted on the chassis of the AB armored cars fitted with the Mod 1941 turret. This version is sometimes known as the AB40/41 hybrid, although it was never officially called that. The registers of the Ufficio Autonomo Approvvigionamenti Automobilistici Regio Esercito, or Royal Army Autonomous Automobile Procurement Office, which lists the vehicle produced with their registration, chassis number and engine number, mention the AB40 version as a vehicle still produced in 1941 and early 1942. According to these registers, the armored cars registered from 116B to 551B would be AB40, i.e. 435 units produced. Those registered from 552B to 784B, i.e. 232 vehicles, would be AB41s. This means that a large number of the AB40s actually had the Mod 1941 turret mounted. As soon as the production order was received, Fiat started to build the assembly lines and produce the new armored cars. 5 pre-series vehicles were finished in March 1941 and were delivered to the Armored Car Training Center of Pinerolo for crew training. Another unknown number of pre-series vehicles, slightly modified with the addition of a searchlight on the roof of the turret and a littorio beam, the symbol of the Italian Fascist Party, on the front of the hull, were sent to the training center of the Italian African Police in Rome. Due to the entry into the war, the PAI did not receive many ABs, which went to the army instead. When the African campaign began on the 13th of September 1940, the PAI supported the 132nd Divisione Corazzata Ariete, or the 132nd Armored Division of the Royal Army, with motorcyclist companies. In 1941, all the armored cars it owned, 60 AB40s and AB41s, were used to equip 5 armored car companies and were sent to Africa. On the first day of the war, a company with 10 old armored cars crossed the border with Egypt. After a few kilometers, almost all the vehicles were destroyed by friendly fire. From that moment, all the PAI's AB40 and AB41 armored cars had the Italian flag painted on the sides and on the front of the superstructure in order to distinguish them even at a distance. When they were not in use, they stayed in the barracks in Benghazi and Tripoli. For the rest of the African campaign, the ABs of the PAI fought alongside the units of the Royal Army. It is not clear when, but before the Tunisian campaign, due to the losses suffered, the PAI police officers and the very few survivors were aggregated into the army units. The PAI men and some AB41 armored cars fought in Rome during the days after the armistice on the 8th of September 1943. The Royal Italian Army used AB40s only in Italy and the Balkans. In Italy, the first 5 pre-production units, one of the 2 prototypes and an unknown number of units were used in the Centro di Addestramento Autoblindo, or the Armored Car Training Center of Pinerolo near Turin. There, in March 1941, the training courses of the crews on the new armored cars began. The first crews of the Royal Army that employed the AB40 and AB41 at the outbreak of the war did not have a specific training for the new vehicles, but were trained to fight on the old Lancia 1ZMs. The AB40 was used extensively by the students of the training center, together with the AB41s, probably AB40-41 hybrids, after the Cassaville Armistice on the 8th of September 1943. Their fate remains uncertain. In 1942, the Royal Army took from the Armoured Car Training Centre 12 armoured cars, 8 AB40s and 4 AB41s, which were taken to the Fiat factories in Turin, where they were modified to be used on the railways. These armoured cars, nicknamed ferrovieri, were used to prevent sabotage by Yugoslav partisans on the railway lines of the territories occupied by Italians in the Balkans. The 12 armoured cars were replaced by AB41s in the following months. After the armistice, the Germans occupied the factories of Fiat and Ansaldo and also captured or requisitioned all the Italian vehicles used by the Royal Army. The confused days after the armistice brought the Italian soldiers, left without orders and officers, to take decisions autonomously in all of the occupied territories and also in Italy. Some decided to fight against the Germans, joining the Allies. Others, loyal to Mussolini, continued to fight together with the Germans, and others deserted, returning to their homes or joining the partisan brigades. This led the Germans to be very suspicious of Italian soldiers. The Germans also needed to replace the vehicles they lost in battle with anything available. On the 23rd of September 1943, Benito Mussolini founded the Repubblica Sociale Italiana, or RSI, the Italian Social Republic, in the Italian territories still under fascist and German control. Many Italian soldiers, still loyal to Mussolini and fascist ideology, joined the RSI and joined his new army, the Esercito Nazionale Repubblicano, or ENR, the National Republican Army. The German army provided the new Italian army with a few tanks and armoured cars that formed the armoured nucleus of the ENR. The divisions of the Guardia Nazionale Repubblicana, or GNR, the National Republican Guard, the fascist military police, however, were forced to rearm themselves without any assistance by building improvised or rudimentary armoured cars, such as the Lancia 3RO blindato of the Black Brigade, or by searching in warehouses and stores for any vehicles still able to fight. The Gruppo Corazzato Leonessa, or the Armoured Group Lioness, operating in Piedmont, Lombardy, and Emilia-Romagna, managed to take possession of dozens of transport vehicles which were used in anti-partisan actions and were armoured, such as the SPA Viberti AB43 armoured cars. The Leonessa also managed to employ 18 AB41 armoured cars found in northern Italy. According to an unconfirmed source, some of these armoured cars were recovered from the Centro di Addestramento Autoblindo di Pinerolo. However, it is not clear why the use of AB40 is not mentioned in the ranks of the Leonessa. Two hypotheses have been made. The first is that the AB40s were disassembled and used as spare parts because by then the armament was obsolete. The second hypothesis instead states that the turrets of the armoured cars were replaced with Mod 1941 turrets supplied by the SPA factory in Turin. The AB40 was a revolutionary armoured car for the Royal Italian Army, with some very modern features, such as double driving positions and independent suspension for each wheel. However, its armament was insufficient for the infantry support role. This deficit led Fiat and Ansaldo technicians to develop a new version, the better-armed AB41, and other vehicles on the same chassis. The few examples produced were mostly used to train the crews of Italian armoured cars.